children played in the dust. They wore strange costumes, all. The men in dark, flat-crowned hats, white nightshirts, trousers that buttoned up the outside leg. And the girls with garish painted faces and tortoise-shell combs in their blue-black hair. The kid crossed the street with a mule and tied it and entered the cafe. A number of men were standing at the bar, and they quit talking when he entered. He crossed the polished clay floor past a sleeping dog that opened one eye and looked at him, and he stood at the bar and placed both hands on the tiles. The barman nodded to him. "Dígame," he said. "I ain't got no money, but I need a drink. I'll fetch out the slops or mop the floor or whatever." The barman looked across the room to where two men were playing dominoes at a table. "Abuelito," he said. The older of the two raised his head. "¿Qué dice el muchacho?" The old man looked at the kid and turned back to his dominoes. The barman shrugged his shoulders. The kid turned to the old man. "You speak American?" he said. The old man looked up from his play. He regarded the kid without expression. "Tell him I'll work for a drink. I ain't got no money." The old man thrust his chin and made a clucking noise with his tongue. The kid looked at the barman. The old man made a fist with the thumb pointing up and the little finger down, and tilted his head back and tipped a phantom drink down his throat. "Quiere echarse una copa," he said, "pero no puede pagar." The men at the bar watched. The barman looked at the kid. "Quiere trabajo," said the old man. "Quién sabe?" He turned back to his pieces and made his play without further consultation. "Quieres trabajar?" said one of the men at the bar. They began to laugh. "What are you laughing at?" said the boy. They stopped. Some looked at him, some pursed their mouths or shrugged. The boy turned to the bartender. "You got something I could do for a couple of drinks. I know damn good and well." One of the men at the bar said something in Spanish. The boy glared at them. They winked one to the other. They took up their glasses. He turned to the barman again. His eyes were dark and narrow. "Sweep the floor," he said. The barman blinked. The kid stepped back and made sweeping motions, a pantomime that bent the drinkers in silent mirth. "Sweep," he said, pointing at the floor. "No está sucio," said the barman. He swept again. "Sweep, goddammit," he said. The barman shrugged. He went to the end of the bar and got a broom and brought it back. The boy took it and went on to the back of the room. A great hall of a place. He swept in the corners where potted trees stood silent in the dark. He swept around the spittoons, and he swept around the players at the table, and he swept around the dog. He swept along the front of the bar, and when he reached the place where the drinkers stood, he straightened up and leaned on the broom and looked at them. Silently among themselves, and at last one took his glass from the bar and stepped away. The others followed. The kid swept past them to the door. The dancers had gone, the music. Across the street sat a man on a bench dimly lit in the doorlight from the cafe. The mule stood where he'd tied it. He tapped the broom on the steps and came back in and took the broom to the corner where the barman had gotten it. Then he came to the bar and stood. The barman ignored him. The kid rapped with his knuckles. The barman turned and put one hand on his hip and pursed his lips. "How about that drink now?" said the kid. The barman stood. The kid made the drinking motions that the old man had made, and the barman flapped his towel idly at him. "Ándale," he said. He made a shooing motion with the back of his hand. The kid's face clouded. "You son of a bitch," he said. He started down the bar. The barman's expression didn't change. He brought up from under the bar an old-fashioned military pistol with a flintlock and shoved back the cock with the heel of his hand. A great wooden clicking in the silence, a clicking of glasses all down the bar. Then the scuffling of chairs pushed back by the players at the wall. The kid froze. "Old man," he said. The old man didn't answer. There was no sound in the cafe. The kid turned to find him with his eyes. "Está borracho," said the old man. The boy watched the barman's eyes. The barman waved the pistol toward the door. The old man spoke to the room in Spanish. Then he spoke to the barman. Then he put on his hat and went out. The barman's face drained. When he came around the end of the bar, he had laid down the pistol, and he was carrying a bung starter in one hand. The kid backed to the center of the room, and the barman labored over the floor toward him like a man on his way to some chore. He swung twice at the kid, and the kid stepped twice to the right. Then he stepped backward. The barman froze. The kid boosted himself lightly over the bar and picked up the pistol. No one moved. He raked the frizzen open against the bar top and dumped the priming out and laid the pistol down again. Then he selected a pair of full bottles from the shelves behind him and came around the end of the bar with one in each hand. The barman stood in the center of the room. He was breathing heavily, and he turned, following the kid's movements. When the kid approached him, he raised the bung starter. The kid crouched lightly with the bottles and fainted, and then broke the right one over the man's head. Blood and liquor sprayed, and the man's knees buckled and his eyes rolled. The kid had already let go the bottleneck, and he pitched the second bottle into his right hand in a road agent's pass before it even reached the floor. And he backhanded the second bottle across the barman's skull and crammed the jagged remnant into his eye as he went down. The kid looked around the room. Some of those men wore pistols in their belts, but none moved. The kid vaulted the bar and took another bottle and tucked it under his arm and walked out the door. The dog was gone. The man on the bench was gone, too. He untied the mule and led it across the square. He woke in the nave of a ruinous church, blinking up at the vaulted ceiling and the tall, swagged walls with their faded frescoes. The floor of the church was deep in dried guano and the droppings of cattle and sheep. Pigeons flapped through the piers of dusty light, and 3 buzzards hobbled about on the picked bone carcass of some animal dead in the chancel. His head was in torment, and his tongue swollen with thirst. He sat up and looked around him. He'd put the bottle under his saddle, and he found it and held it up and shook it and drew the cork and drank. He sat with his eyes closed, the sweat beaded on his forehead. Then he opened his eyes and drank again. The buzzards stepped down one by one and trotted off into the sacristy. After a while he rose and went out to look for the mule. It was nowhere in sight. The mission occupied 8 or 10 acres of enclosed land, a barren purlieu that held a few goats and burros. In the mud walls of the enclosure were cribs inhabited by families of squatters, and a few cook fires smoked thinly in the sun. He walked around the side of the church and entered the sacristy. Buzzards shuffled off through the chaff and plaster like enormous yard fowl. The domed vaults overhead were clotted with a dark, furred mass that shifted and breathed and chittered. In the room was a wooden table with a few clay pots, and along the back wall lay the remains of several bodies, one a child. He went on through the sacristy into the church again and got his saddle. He drank the rest of the bottle, and he put the saddle on his shoulder and went out. The facade of the building bore an array of saints in their niches, and they had been shot up by American troops trying their rifles. The figures shorn of ears and noses and darkly mottled with lead marks oxidized upon the stone. The huge carved and paneled doors hung a wap on their hinges, and a carved stone virgin held in her arms a headless child. He stood blinking in the noon heat. Then he saw the mule's tracks. They were just the palest disturbance of the dust, and they came out of the door of the church and crossed the lot to the gate in the east wall. He hiked the saddle higher onto his shoulder and set out after them. A dog in the shade of the portal rose and lurched sullenly out into the sun until he had passed, and then lurched back. He took the road down the hill toward the river, a ragged figure enough. He entered a deep wood of pecan and oak, and the road took a rise, and he could see the river below him. Blacks were washing a carriage in the ford, and he went down the hill and stood at the edge of the water, and after a while he called out to them. They were sopping water over the black lacquer work, and one of them raised up and turned to look at him. The horses stood to their knees in the current. "What?" called the black. "Have you seen a mule?" "Mule?" "I lost a mule. I think he come this way." The black wiped his face with the back of his arm. "Something come down the road about an hour back. I think it went down the river yonder. Might have been a mule. It didn't have no tail, nor no hair to speak of, but it did have long ears." The other two blacks grinned. The kid looked off down the river. He spat and set off along the path through the willows and swales of grass. He found it about 100 yards downriver. It was wet to its belly, and it looked up at him and then lowered its head again into the lush river grass. He threw down the saddle and took up the trailing rope and tied the animal to a limb and kicked it half-heartedly. It shifted slightly to the side and continued to graze. He reached atop his head, but he had lost the crazy hat somewhere. He made his way down through the trees and stood looking at the cold, swirling waters. Then he waded out into the river like some wholly wretched baptismal candidate. Chapter 3. Sought out to join an army. Interview with Captain White. His views. The camp. Trades his mule. A cantina in the Laredito. A Mennonite. Companion killed. He was lying naked under the trees, with his rags spread across the limbs above him, when another rider going down the river reined up and stopped. He turned his head. Through the willows he could see the legs of the horse. He rolled over on his stomach. The man got down and stood beside the horse. He reached and got his twine-handled knife. "Howdy there," said the rider. He didn't answer. He moved to the side to see better through the branches. "Howdy there. Where you at?" "What do you want?" "Wanted to talk to you." "What about?" "Hellfire, come on out. I'm white and Christian." The kid was reaching up through the willows trying to get his britches. The belt was hanging down, and he tugged at it, but the britches were hung on a limb. "Goddamn," said the man. "You ain't up in the tree, are you?" "Why don't you go on and leave me the hell alone?" "Just wanted to talk to you. Didn't intend to get you all riled up." "You done got me riled." "Was you the fella knocked in that Mexer's head yesterday evening? I ain't the law." "Who wants to know?" "Captain White. He wants to sign that feller up to join the army." "The army?" "Yes, sir." "What army?" "Company under Captain White. We're going to whip up on the Mexicans." "The war's over." "He says it ain't over. Where are you at?" He rose and hauled the breeches down from where he'd hung them and pulled them on. He pulled on his boots and put the knife in the right boot leg and came out from the willows pulling on his shirt. The man was sitting in the grass with his legs crossed. He was dressed in buckskin, and he wore a plug hat of dusty black silk, and he had a small Mexican cigar in the corner of his teeth. When he saw what clawed its way out through the willows, he shook his head. "Kindly fell on hard times, ain't you, son?" he said. "I just ain't fell on no good ones. You ready to go to Mexico?" "I ain't lost nothing down there." "It's a chance for ye to raise yourself in the world. You best make a move some way or another before you go plumb in under." "What do they give ye?" "Every man gets a horse and his ammunition. I reckon we might find some clothes in your case." "I ain't got no rifle." "We'll find you one." "What about wages?" "Hell, fire, son, you won't need no wages. You get to keep everything you can raise. We go into Mexico. Spoils of war. And a man in the company won't come out a big landowner. How much land you own now?" "I don't know nothing about soldiering." The man eyed him. He took the unlit cigar from his teeth and turned his head and spat and put it back again. "Where you from?" he said. "Tennessee." "Tennessee? Well, I don't misdoubt but what you can shoot a rifle." The kid squatted in the grass. He looked at the man's horse. The horse was fitted out in tooled leather with worked silver trim. It had a white blaze on its face and 4 white stockings, and it was cropping up great teethfuls of the rich grass. "Where you from?" said the kid. "I've been in Texas since '38. If I had not run up on Captain White, I don't know where I'd be this day. I was a sorrier sight even than what you are, and he come along and raised me up like Lazarus, set my feet in the path of righteousness. I done took to drinking and whoring till hell wouldn't have me. He seen something in me worth saving, and I see it in you. What do you say?" "I don't know." "Just come with me and meet the captain." The boy pulled at the haulms of grass. He looked at the horse again. "Well," he said, "don't reckon it'd hurt nothing." They rode through the town with the recruiter splendid on the stocking-footed horse, and the kid behind him on the mule like something he'd captured. They rode through narrow lanes where the wattled huts steamed in the heat. Grass and prickly pear grew on the roofs, and goats walked about on them, and somewhere off in that squalid kingdom of mud the sound of the little death bells tolled thinly. They turned up Commerce Street through the main plaza among rafts of wagons, and they crossed another plaza where boys were selling grapes and figs from little trundle carts. A few bony dogs slank off before them. They rode through the military plaza, and they passed the little street where the boy and the mule had drunk the night before, and there were clusters of women and girls at the well, and many shapes of wicker-covered clay jars standing about. They passed a little house where women inside were wailing, and the little hearse cart stood at the door with the horses patient and motionless in the heat and the flies. The captain kept quarters in a hotel on a plaza where there were trees and a small green gazebo with benches. An iron gate at the hotel front opened into a passageway with a courtyard at the rear. The walls were whitewashed and set with little ornate colored tiles. The captain's man wore carved boots with tall heels that rang smartly on the tiles and on the stairs ascending from the courtyard to the rooms above. In the courtyard there were green plants growing, and they were freshly watered and steaming. The captain's man strode down the long balcony and rapped sharply at the door at the end. A voice said for them to come in. He sat at a wickerwork desk, writing letters, the captain. They stood attending, the captain's man with his black hat in his hands. The captain rode on, nor did he look up. Outside, the kid could hear a woman speaking in Spanish. Other than that, there was just the scratching of the captain's pen. When he had done, he laid down the pen and looked up. He looked at his man, and then he looked at the kid, and then he bent his head to read what he'd written. He nodded to himself and dusted the letter with sand from a little onyx box and folded it. Taking a match from a box of them on the desk, he lit it and held it to a stick of sealing wax until a small red medallion had pooled onto the paper. He shook out the match, blew briefly at the paper, and knuckled the seal with his ring. Then he stood the letter between two books on his desk and leaned back in his chair and looked at the kid again. He nodded gravely. "Take seats," he said. They eased themselves into a kind of settle made from some dark wood. The captain's man had a large revolver at his belt, and as he sat, he hitched the belt around so that the piece lay cradled between his thighs. He put his hat over it and leaned back. The kid folded his busted boots one behind the other and sat upright. The captain pushed his chair back and rose and came around to the front of the desk. He stood there for a measured minute, and then he hitched himself up on the desk and sat with his boots dangling. He had gray in his hair and in the sweeping mustaches that he wore, but he wasn't old. "So you're the man," he said. "What man?" said the kid. "What man, sir?" said the captain's man. "How old are you, son?" 19. The captain nodded his head. He was looking the kid over. "What happened to you?" "What?" "Say, sir," said the recruiter. "Sir?" "I said, what happened to you?" The kid looked at the man sitting next to him. He looked down at himself, and he looked at the captain again. "I was fell on by robbers," he said. "Robbers," said the captain. "Took everything I had. Took my watch and everything." "Have you got a rifle?" "Not no more, I ain't." "Where was it you were robbed?" "I don't know. There wasn't no name to it. It was just a wilderness." "Where were you coming from?" "I was coming from Nacogdoches?" "Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir." "How many were there?" The kid stared at him. "Robbers. How many robbers?" 7 or 8, I reckon. I got busted in the head with a scantling." The captain squinted one eye at him. "Were they Mexicans?" "Some. Mexicans and niggers. There was a white or two with them. They had a bunch of cattle they'd stole. Only thing they left me with was an old piece of knife I had in my boot." The captain nodded. He folded his hands between his knees. "What do you think of the treaty?" he said. The kid looked at the man on the settle next to him. He had his eyes shut. He looked down at his thumbs. "I don't know nothing about it," he said. "I'm afraid that's the case with a lot of Americans," said the captain. "Where are you from, son?" "Tennessee." "You weren't with the volunteers at Monterey, were you?" "No, sir." "Bravest bunch of men under fire I believe I ever saw. I suppose more men from Tennessee bled and died on the field in northern Mexico than from any other state. Did you know that?" "No, sir." "They were sold out. Fought and died down there in that desert, and then they were sold out by their own country." The kid sat silent. The captain leaned forward. "We fought for it. Lost friends and brothers down there, and then, by God, if we didn't give it back. Back to a bunch of barbarians that even the most biased in their favor will admit have no least notion in God's earth of honor or justice or the meaning of republican government. A people so cowardly they've paid tribute 100 years to tribes of naked savages. Giving up their crops and livestock, mines shut down, whole villages abandoned, while a heathen horde rides over the land, looting and killing with total impunity. Not a hand raised against them. What kind of people are these? The Apaches won't even shoot them. Did you know that? They kill them with rocks. The captain shook his head. He seemed made sad by what he had to tell. Did you know that when Colonel Doniphan took Chihuahua City, he inflicted over 1,000 casualties on the enemy and lost only one man, and him all but a suicide? With an army of unpaid irregulars that called him Bill, were half naked, and had walked to the battlefield from Missouri? No, sir. The captain leaned back and folded his arms. What we are dealing with, he said, is a race of degenerates. A mongrel race, little better than niggers, and maybe no better. There is no government in Mexico. Hell, there's no God in Mexico. Never will be. We are dealing with a people manifestly incapable of governing themselves. And you know what happens with people who cannot govern themselves? That's right. Others come in to govern for them. There are already some 14,000 French colonists in the state of Sonora. They're being given free land to settle. They're being given tools and livestock. Enlightened Mexicans encourage this. Paredes is already calling for secession from the Mexican government. They'd rather be ruled by toad-eaters than thieves and imbeciles. Colonel Carrasco is asking for American intervention, and he's going to get it. Right now, they're forming in Washington a commission to come out here and draw up the boundary lines between our country and Mexico. I don't think there's any question that ultimately Sonora will become a United States territory. Guayama's a U.S. port. Americans will be able to get to California without having to pass through our benighted sister republic, and our citizens will be protected at last from the notorious packs of cutthroats presently infesting the routes which they are obliged to travel. The captain was watching the kid. The kid looked uneasy. Son, said the captain, we are to be the instruments of liberation in a dark and troubled land. That's right. We are to spearhead the drive. We have the tacit support of Governor Burnett of California. He leaned forward and placed his hands on his knees. And we will be the ones who will divide the spoils. There will be a section of land for every man in my company. Fine grassland, some of the finest in the world. A land rich in minerals, in gold and silver, I would say, beyond the wildest speculation. You're young, but I don't misread you. I'm seldom mistaken in a man. I think you mean to make your mark in this world. Am I wrong? No, sir. No. And I don't think you're the sort of chap to abandon a land that Americans fought and died for to a foreign power. And mark my word, unless Americans act, people like you and me who take their country seriously, while those mollycoddles in Washington sit on their hindsides, unless we act, Mexico, and I mean the whole of the country, will one day fly a European flag, Monroe Doctrine or no. The captain's voice had become soft and intense. He tilted his head to one side and regarded the kid with a sort of benevolence. The kid rubbed the palms of his hands on the knees of his filthy jeans. He glanced at the man beside him, but he seemed to be asleep. What about a saddle? He said. Saddle? Yes, sir. You don't have a saddle? No, sir. I thought you had a horse. A mule. I see. I got an old hull on the mule, but there ain't much left of it. Ain't a whole lot left of the mule. He said I was to get a horse and a rifle. Sergeant Trammell did? I never promised him no saddle, said the sergeant. We'll get you a saddle. I did tell him we might find him some clothes, Captain. Right. We may be irregulars, but we don't want to look like bobtails, do we? No, sir. We ain't got no more broke horses, neither, said the sergeant. Well, break one. That old boy that was so good about breaking them is out of commission. I know that. Get somebody else. Yes, sir. Maybe this man can break horses. You ever break horses? No, sir. Ain't no need to sir me. Yes, sir. Sergeant, said the captain, easing himself down from the desk. Yes, sir? Sign this man up. The camp was upriver at the edge of the town. A tent patched up from old wagon canvas, a few wickiups made of brush, and beyond them a corral in the form of a figure eight, likewise made from brush, where a few small painted ponies stood sulking in the sun. Corporal, called the sergeant. He ain't here. He dismounted and strode toward the tent and threw back the fly. The kid sat on the mule. 3 men were lying in the shade of a tree, and they studied him. Hattie, said one. Hattie. You new man? I reckon. Captain say when we're leaving this pest hole? He never said. The sergeant came from the tent. Where's he at? He said. Gone to town. Gone to town, said the sergeant. Come here. The man rose from the ground and ambled over to the tent and stood with his hands resting in the small of his back. This here man ain't got no outfit, said the sergeant. The man nodded. The captain gave him a shirt and some money to get his boots mended. We need to get him something he can ride, and we need to get him a saddle. A saddle? Ought to be able to sell that mule for enough to get him one of some kind. The man looked at the mule and turned back and squinted at the sergeant. He leaned and spat. That there mule won't bring $10. What it brings, it brings. They done killed another beef. I don't want to hear about it. I can't do nothing with 'em. I ain't telling the captain. He'll roll them eyes around till they come unscrewed and fall out in the ground. The man spat again. Well, that's the God's truth anyway. See to this man now. I got to get. Well, ain't nobody sick, is they? No. Thank God for that. He stood up into the saddle and touched the horse's neck lightly with the reins. He looked back and shook his head. In the evening, the kid and 2 other recruits went into town. He'd bathed and shaved himself, and he wore a pair of blue cord trousers and the cotton shirt the captain had given him, and save for the boots, he looked a new man altogether. His friends rode small and colorful horses that 40 days ago had been wild animals on the plain, and they shied and skittered and snapped like turtles. Wait till you get you one of these, said the second corporal. You ain't never had no fun. These horses is all right, said the other. There's 1 or 2 in there yet that might make ye a horse. The kid looked down at them from his mule. They rode either side like escorts, and the mule trotted with its head up, its eyes shifting nervously. They'll all stick your head in the ground, said the second corporal. They rode through a plaza thronged with wagons and stock, with immigrants and Texans and Mexicans, and with slaves and Lipan Indians, and deputations of Karankawas, tall and austere, their faces dyed blue, and their hands locked about the shafts of their 6-foot spears, all but naked savages who, with their painted skins and their whispered taste for human flesh, seemed outrageous presences, even in that fabled company. The recruits rode with their animals close-reined, and they turned up past the courthouse and along the high walls of the castle with the broken glass embedded in the topmost course. In the main plaza, a band had assembled and were at tuning their instruments. The riders turned down Salina Street past small gaming houses and coffee stands, And there were in this street a number of Mexican harness makers and traders and keepers of game chickens and cobblers and bootmakers in little stalls or shops of mud. The second corporal was from Texas and spoke a little Spanish, and he meant to trade the mule. The other boy was from Missouri. They were in good spirits, scrubbed and combed, clean shirts all, each foreseeing a night of drink, perhaps of love. How many youths have come home cold and dead from just such nights and just such plans? They traded the mule, accoutered as it was, for a Texas stock saddle, bare tree with rawhide cover, not new, but sound. For a bridle and bit that was new. For a woven wool blanket from Saltillo that was dusty, new or not. And lastly, for a $2.50 gold piece. The Texan looked at this small coin in the kid's palm and demanded more money, but the harness maker shook his head and held up his hands in utter finality. "What about my boots?" said the kid. "Y sus botas," said the Texan. "Botas? Sí." He made sewing motions. The harness maker looked down at the boots. He cupped his fingers in a little gesture of impatience, and the kid took off the boots and stood barefoot in the dust. When all was done, they stood in the street and looked at one another. The kid had his new tack slung up on his shoulder. The second corporal looked at the boy from
preface of a general introduction to psychoanalysis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Translated by Granville Stanley Hall. Preface. Few, especially in this country, realize that while Freudian themes have rarely found a place on the programs of the American Psychological Association, they have attracted great and growing attention and found frequent elaboration by students of literature, history, biography, sociology, morals and aesthetics, anthropology, education, and religion. They have given the world a new conception of both infancy and adolescence and shed much new light upon characterology, given us a new and clearer view of sleep, dreams, reveries, and revealed hitherto unknown mental mechanisms common to normal and pathological states and processes, showing that the law of causation extends to the most incoherent acts and even verbigerations in insanity, gone far to clear up the terra incognita of hysteria, taught us to recognize morbid symptoms, often neurotic and psychotic in their germ, revealed the operations of the primitive mind so overlaid and repressed that we had almost lost sight of them, fashioned and used the key of symbolism to unlock many mysticisms of the past, and in addition to all this, effected thousands of cures, established a new prophylaxis, and suggested new tests for character, disposition, and ability, in all combining the practical and theoretic to a degree salutary as it is rare. These 28 lectures to laymen are elementary and almost conversational. Freud sets forth with a frankness and almost startling the difficulties and limitations of psychoanalysis, and also describes its main methods and results as only a master and originator of a new school of thought can do. These discourses are at the same time simple and almost confidential, and they trace and sum up the results of 30 years of devoted and painstaking research. While they are not all controversial, we incidentally see a clearer light the distinctions between the master and some of his distinguished pupils. A text like this is the most opportune and will naturally more or less supersede all other introductions to the general subject of psychoanalysis. It presents the author in a new light as an effective and successful popularizer, and is certain to be welcomed not only by the large and growing number of students of psychoanalysis in this country, but by the yet larger number of those who wish to begin its study here and elsewhere. The impartial student of Sigmund Freud need not agree with all his conclusions, and indeed, like the present writer, may be unable to make sex so all-dominating a factor in the psychic life of the past and present as Freud deems it to be, to recognize the fact that he is the most original and creative mind in psychology of our generation. Despite the frightful handicap of the odium sexicum, far more formidable today than the odium theologicum, involving, as it has done for him, lack of academic recognition, and even more or less social ostracism, his views have attracted and inspired a brilliant group of minds, not only in psychiatry, but in many other fields, who have altogether given the world of culture more new and pregnant apicus than those which have come from any other source within the wide domain of humanism. A former student and disciple of Wundt, who recognizes to the full his inestimable services to our science, cannot avoid making certain comparisons. Wundt has had for decades the prestige of a most advantageous academic chair. He founded the first laboratory for experimental psychology, which attracted many of the most gifted and mature students from all lands. By his development of the doctrine of apperception, he took psychology forever beyond the old associationism which had ceased to be fruitful. He also established the independence of psychology from physiology, and by his encyclopedic and always thronged lectures, to say nothing of his more or less esoteric seminary, he materially advanced every branch of mental science and extended its influence over the whole wide domain of folklore, mores, language, and primitive religion. His best texts will long constitute a thesaurus which every psychologist must know. Again, like Freud, he inspired students who went beyond him, the Wurzburgers and introspectionists, whose method and results he could not follow. His limitations have grown more and more manifest. He has little use for the unconscious or the abnormal, and for the most part he has lived and wrought in a pre-evolutionary age, and always and everywhere underestimated the genetic standpoint. He never transcends the conventional limits in dealing, as he so rarely does, with sex. Nor does he contribute much likely to be permanent value in any part of the wide domain of affectivity. We cannot forbear to express the hope that Freud will not repeat Wundt's error in making too abrupt a break with his more advanced pupils like Adler or the Zurich group. It is rather precisely just the topics that Wundt neglects that Freud makes his chief cornerstones, viz. The unconscious, the abnormal sex, and affectionately generally, with many genetic, especially ontogenetic, but also phylogenetic factors. The Wundtian influence has been great in the past, while Freud has a great present and yet greater future. In one thing Freud agrees with the introspectionist Phys in deliberately neglecting the physiological factor and building on purely psychological foundations, although for Freud psychology is mainly unconscious, while for the introspectionist it is pure consciousness. Neither he nor his disciples have yet recognized the aid proffered them by students of the autonomic system, or by the distinctions between the epicritic and protopathic functions and organs of the cerebrum, although these will doubtless come to have their due place as we know more of the nature and processes of the unconscious mind. If psychologists of the normal have hitherto been too disposed to recognize the precious contributions to psychology made by the cruel experiments of nature in mental diseases, we think that the psychoanalysts who work predominantly in this field have been somewhat too ready to apply their findings to the operations of the normal mind. But we are optimistic enough to believe that in the end both these errors will vanish, and that in the great synthesis of the future that now seems to impend our science will be made vastly richer and deeper on the theoretical side, and also far more practical than it has ever been before. G. Stanley Hall, Clark University, April 1920. End of preface. Section 1 of A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Translated by Granville Stanley Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. Section 1. First Lecture, Introduction. I do not know how familiar some of you may be, either from your reading or from hearsay, with psychoanalysis. But in keeping with the title of these lectures, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, I am obliged to proceed as though you knew nothing about this subject and stood in need of preliminary instruction. To be sure, this much I may presume that you do know, namely, that psychoanalysis is a method of treating nervous patients medically. And just at this point I can give you an example to illustrate how the procedure in this field is precisely the reverse of that which is the rule in medicine. Usually when we introduce a patient to a medical technique which is strange to him, we minimize its difficulties and give him confident promises concerning the result of the treatment. When, however, we undertake psychoanalytic treatment with a neurotic patient, we proceed differently. We hold before him the difficulties of the method, its length, the exertions and the sacrifices which it will cost him. And as to the result, we tell him that we make no definite promises, that the result depends on his conduct, on his understanding, on his adaptability, on his perseverance. We have, of course, excellent motives for conduct, which seems so perverse, and into which you will perhaps gain insight at a later point in these lectures. Do not be offended, therefore, if, for the present, I treat you as I treat these neurotic patients. Frankly, I shall dissuade you from coming to hear me a second time. With this intention, I shall show what imperfections are necessarily involved in the teaching of psychoanalysis, and what difficulties stand in the way of gaining a personal judgment. I shall show you how the whole trend of your previous training and all your accustomed mental habits must unavoidably have made you opponents of psychoanalysis, and how much you must overcome in yourselves in order to master this instinctive opposition. Of course, I cannot predict how much psychoanalytic understanding you will gain from my lectures, but I can promise this, that by listening to them, you will not learn how to undertake a psychoanalytic treatment or how to carry one to completion. Furthermore, should I find anyone among you who does not feel satisfied with a cursory acquaintance with psychoanalysis, but who would like to enter into a more enduring relationship with it, I shall not only dissuade him, but I shall actually warn him against it. As things now stand, a person would, by such a choice of profession, ruin his every chance of success at a university, and if he goes out into the world as a practicing physician, he will find himself in a society which does not understand his aims, which regards him with suspicion and hostility, and which turns loose upon him all the malicious spirits which lurk within it. However, there are always enough individuals who are interested in anything which may be added to the sum total of knowledge despite such inconveniences. Should there be any of this type among you, and should they ignore my dissuasion and return to the next of these lectures, they will be welcome. But all of you have the right to know what these difficulties of psychoanalysis are to which I have alluded. First of all, we encounter the difficulties inherent in the teaching and exposition of psychoanalysis. In your medical instruction, you have been accustomed to visual demonstration. You see the anatomical specimen, the precipitate in the chemical reaction, the contraction of the muscle as the result of the stimulation of its nerves. Later, the patient is presented to your senses, the symptoms of his malady, the products of the pathological processes. In many cases, even the cause of the disease is shown in isolated state. In the surgical department, you are made to witness the steps by which one brings relief to the patient and are permitted to attempt to practice them. Even in psychiatry, the demonstration affords you by the patient's changed facial play, his manner of speech and his behavior, a wealth of observations which leave far-reaching impressions. Thus the medical teacher preponderantly plays the role of a guide and instructor who accompanies you through a museum in which you contract an immediate relationship to the exhibits and in which you believe yourself to have been convinced through your own observation of the existence of the new things you see. Unfortunately, everything is different in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, nothing occurs but the interchange of words between the patient and the physician. The patient talks, tells of his past experiences and presents impressions, complains, confesses his wishes and emotions. The physician listens, trying to direct the thought process of the patient, reminds him of things, forces his attention into certain channels, gives him explanations, and observes the reactions of understanding or denial which he calls forth in the patient. The uneducated relatives of our patients, persons who are impressed only by the visible and tangible, preferably by such procedure as one sees in the moving picture theatres, never miss an opportunity of voicing their skepticism as to how one can do anything for the malady through mere talk. Such thinking, of course, is as short-sighted as it is inconsistent, for these are the very persons who know with such certainty that the patients merely imagine their symptoms. Words were originally magic, and the words retain much of its old magical power even today. With words one can make another blessed, or drive him to despair. By words the teacher transfers his knowledge to the pupil. By words the speaker sweeps his audience with him and determines its judgments and decisions. Words call forth effects and are the universal means of influencing human beings. Therefore, let us not underestimate the use of words in psychotherapy, and let us be satisfied if we may be auditors of the words which are exchanged between the analyst and his patient. But even that is impossible. The conversation of which the psychoanalytic treatment consists brooks no auditor. It cannot be demonstrated. One can, of course, present a neurasthenic or hysteric to the students in a psychiatric lecture. He tells of his complaints and symptoms, but of nothing else. The communications which are necessary for the analysis are made only under the conditions of a special affective relationship to the physician. The patient would become dumb as soon as he became aware of a single impartial witness. For these communications concern the most intimate part of his psychic life, everything which, as a socially independent person, he must conceal from others. These communications deal with everything which, as a harmonious personality, he will not admit even to himself. You cannot, therefore, listen in on a psychoanalytic treatment. You can only hear of it. You will get to know psychoanalysis in the strictest sense of the word only by hearsay. Such instruction, even at second hand, will place you in quite an unusual position for forming a judgment. For it is obvious that everything depends on the faith you are able to put in the instructor. Imagine that you were not attending a psychiatric, but an historical lecture, and that the lecturer is telling you about the life and martial deeds of Alexander the Great. What would your reasons for believing in the authenticity of his statements? At first sight, the condition of affairs seems even more unfavourable than in the case of psychoanalysis, for the history professor was as little a participant in Alexander's campaigns as you were. The psychoanalyst at least tells you of things in connection with which he himself has played some role. But then the question turns on this. What set of facts can the historian marshal in support of his position? He can refer you to the accounts of ancient authors who were either contemporaries themselves or who were at least closer to the events in question. That is, he will refer you to the books of Diodor, Plutarch, Arrian, etc. He can place before you pictures of the preserved coins and statues of the king, and can pass down your rows a photograph of the Pompeian mosaics of the Battle of Issos. Yet, strictly speaking, all these documents prove only that previous generations already believed in Alexander's existence and in the reality of his deeds, and your criticism might begin anew at this point. You will then find that not everything recounted of Alexander is credible or capable of proof in detail. Yet even then I cannot believe that you will leave the lecture hall a disbeliever in the reality of Alexander the Great. Your decision will be determined chiefly by two considerations. Firstly, that the lecturer has no conceivable motive for presenting as truth something which he does not himself believe to be true, and secondly, that all available histories present the events in approximately the same manner. If you then proceed to the verification of the older sources, you will consider the same data, the possible motives of the writers, and the consistency of the various parts of the evidence. The result of the examination will surely be convincing in the case of Alexander. It will probably turn out differently when applied to individuals like Moses and Nimrod. But what doubts you might raise against the credibility of the psychoanalytic reporter, you will see plainly enough upon a later occasion. At this point, you have a right to raise the question: if there is no such thing as objective verification of psychoanalysis, and no possibility of demonstrating it, how can one possibly learn psychoanalysis and convince himself of the truth of its claims? The fact is, the study is not easy, and there are not many persons who have learned psychoanalysis thoroughly. But nevertheless, there is a feasible way. Psychoanalysis is learned, first of all, from a study of oneself, through the study of one's own personality. This is not quite what is ordinarily called self-observation, but at a pinch, one can sum it up thus. There is a whole series of very common and universally known psychic phenomena, which, after some instruction in the technique of psychoanalysis, one can make the subject matter of analysis in oneself. By doing so, one obtains the desired conviction of the reality of the occurrences which psychoanalysis describes, and of the correctness of its fundamental conception. To be sure, there are definite limits imposed on progress by this method. One gets much further if one allows himself to be analysed by a competent analyst, observes the effects of the analyst on his own ego, and at the same time makes use of the opportunity to become familiar with the finer details of the technique of procedure. This excellent method is, of course, only practicable for one person, never for an entire class. There is a second difficulty in your relation to psychoanalysis for which I cannot hold the science itself responsible, but for which I must ask you to take the responsibility upon yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, at least in so far as you have hitherto pursued medical studies. Your previous training has given your mental activity a definite bent which leads you far away from psychoanalysis. You have been trained to reduce the functions of an organism and its disorders anatomically, to explain them in terms of chemistry and physics, and to conceive them biologically. But no portion of your interest has been directed to the psychic life, in which, after all, the activity of this wonderfully complex organism culminates. For this reason, psychological thinking has remained strange to you, and you have accustomed yourselves to regard it with suspicion, to deny it the character of the scientific, to leave it to the layman poets, natural philosophers, and mystics. Such a delimitation is surely harmful to your medical activity, for the patient will, as is usual in all human relationships, confront you first of all with his psychic facade, and I am afraid your penalty will be this, that you will be forced to relinquish a portion of the therapeutic influence to which you aspire, to those lay physicians, nature cure fakers, and mystics whom you despise. I am not overlooking the excuse, whose existence one must admit, for this deficiency in your previous training. There is no philosophical science of therapy which could be made practicable for your medical purpose. Neither speculative philosophy nor descriptive psychology, nor that so-called experimental psychology, which allies itself with the physiology of the sense organs as it is taught in the schools, is in a position to teach you anything useful concerning the relation between the physical and the psychical, or to put into your hand the key to the understanding of a possible disorder of the psychic functions. Within the field of medicine, psychiatry does, it is true, occupy itself with the description of the observed psychic disorders and with their grouping into clinical symptom pictures. But in their better hours, the psychiatrists themselves doubt whether their purely descriptive account deserves the name of a science.